Well, good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. I trust that many of you will have recognised the archaeologist in this image. We'll come back to him in a moment. In something like 6 months' time, we'll be celebrating the November armistice, which brought warfare on the Western Front to an end and signalled the near end of the First World War. It seems an appropriate time to consider, or actually to indulge my personal interest in the history of archaeology and to consider what role archaeologists played in the war and what role archaeology played as an instrument of propaganda. I'm going to focus on three themes: what archaeologists actually did, the discovery of archaeological remains in the course of the war, and how the treatment of some historic monuments and buildings became the focus for bitter propaganda between the warring parties, and a discussion about protection of monuments and more fundamentally about the nature of civilization. The years since about 2014 have seen a considerable amount of research into the events 100 years ago, mostly started by French and some Belgian archaeologists, more recently taken up by German historians. We know most about what happened on the Western Front, and quite a lot about what happened on the Salonika Front in what's now northeastern Greece, but very little as yet, at least available in English, about what happened on the Eastern Front. I'm going to be talking mostly about the activities of British personnel. They'll also be looking occasionally at French and German involvement of individuals and on other issues. First of all, we'll have a quick word about the state of archaeology in 1914. British archaeology in 1914 was a very small discipline. It's very difficult to count, partly because it's difficult to decide who was an archaeologist. The boundaries between ancient historian and Roman archaeologist, and between archaeologist and art historian or architectural historian, are quite ill-defined. But there were probably no more than about 60 professional archaeologists in Britain, or British archaeologists at the time. They focused in universities, although only very few of them, very few posts other than classical and Egyptological posts, in major museums like the British Museum in Westmalian, and a nascent public service. The Office of Works had an Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments refounded in 1910, and Royal Commissions in English, Wales and Scotland to survey ancient monuments starting work in 1907 and 1908. But these were very small. Major focuses of activity included British School at Athens and recently founded British School in Rome, and other organisations funded by public generosity and dedicated to excavation work, especially in Egypt and Palestine. And it was in these areas, especially the East Mediterranean, Greece, Palestine, Egypt, Turkey, that much of the archaeological activity by British archaeologists was actually carried out. By contrast, German archaeology was much better developed. For many countries, archaeology had been a seat of competitive warfare, at least since the beginning of the 19th century. It was a competitive rivalry in the first place between Britain and France, competing for activities in Egypt, then later in Mesopotamia. The independence of Greece in the 1830s put an end to the export of antiquities from Greece, so people began to look to Turkey. Then, in the late 1850s, the Crimean War put an end to archaeological excavations in the East Mediterranean. When activity started again in the early 1870s, there was a new player in the market, and that was Germany. After the unification of Germany, we suddenly had a transformation. Before that, it was a large number of small, rather underfunded states with ill-provided museums and a lack of finance. After the unification of Germany, the Prussian-led German Empire instituted a policy of aggressive culture, you might call it, a politics of culture and knowledge. One of the most important stages was the development in 1871 of the Archaeological Institute of Germany, funded by the German Foreign Office. Archaeology was a means of overseas exercise of German influence. The Athens branch opened up in 1874, but then, recognising activity at home, a Roman-German commission, Römisch-Germanische Kommission, was founded in 1902, and these were liberally funded public services devoted to archaeological research. In addition to this, the Prussian Empire invested heavily in the expansion of museums, especially in Berlin. And one way of filling your museums was to excavate abroad. In 1898, was another institution, the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, the German Oriental Society, funded very largely by industrial donations from people with names like Krupps and Seaman, founded a fund, set up a fund for excavation, in particular in Mesopotamia, Palestine, Anatolia, Egypt, as a specific competitive exercise to overcome activity by France and Britain. And this was competitive in the extreme. One of the sites excavated in Anatolia was the newly discovered capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa. The English archaeologist John Garstang went there in 1907, believing he had a permit to excavate. When he got there, he found that the Germans had persuaded the Turkish authorities to rescind his permit and give it to a German archaeologist. That's the way the game was played. German archaeology was, in most senses, far ahead of British. It was much better organised, much better funded, technically much better, and aggressively supported by government. And there were also lots more archaeologists. And there were many more jobs in major museums and the major universities of Germany, as well as major excavation projects carried on especially in Mesopotamia and Palestine. Despite this competitive edge, archaeologists actually indulged in international fraternisation. Especially among the classical archaeologists, there was a considerable degree of internal friendship and collaboration. In Mesopotamia, the figure in the centre is the English archaeologist and traveller Gertrude Bell, visiting the German archaeologists at Assur, one of the big excavations in northern Mesopotamia in 1911, where she apparently was on extremely friendly terms with the German archaeologists. The person on her immediate left is the leader of the excavation, Dr. Andrei, and according to some accounts, she quite fell for this rather dapper German. Another major figure in international collaboration was Haverfield, the professor of Roman ancient history at Oxford, and probably the founder of Romano-British archaeology. He himself was a devoted internationalist. He had many German and Austrian collaborators, including the great Roman historian Theodor Monson, whom he translated into English. And there was a feeling among many academics, and particularly among the archaeologists, that somehow academic fraternisation could overcome the political difficulties and lead to peace. Even as late as the 1st of August 1914, there was a letter to the Times signed by professors, including one major professor of archaeology, pleading for peace on the basis of international friendship and collaboration. This didn't happen, and Haverfield himself died shortly after the war, it said, brought on largely by disenchantment at the breakup of international collaboration and the death of some Romano-British archaeologists in the war. When war broke out in August 1914, some archaeology continued. This institute, for instance, carried on its London meetings. If you look at the journal, the run of journals in the library, you'll find an unbroken run through the 1910s. What that doesn't tell you is that it stopped publication for about 5 years, and by 1920 they were 6 years behind publication and only got back on schedule by heroic work by a series of editors. A lot of other work gradually faded out. There were no people to do it, there was no transport. So this institute abandoned its summer meetings because there was no transport to get to people anywhere. Some active archaeological work went on. There was a little bit in Britain, I'll mention one in a moment. Work carried on in Egypt. Greece was technically neutral for another couple of years, so it was possible, if you had the people, to do work in Greece. One of the longest term excavations was in Babylon, under the DOG's funding. Robert Koldewey carried on digging until 1917, when the British Army was almost at the it was advancing actually through northern Mesopotamia. Quite contrary to Ottoman legislation, large quantities of large quantities of antiquities found within the Ottoman Empire were shipped out both by British and German archaeologists. 450 packing cases of material from Babylon were shipped out during the war, got as far as Portugal, where they were impounded at Lisbon for 12 years. There was all sorts of diplomatic negotiation about what to do with these, and it wasn't until 1929 that the Portuguese were persuaded to let stuff get back to Berlin, where the Ishtar Gate, which you may have seen, was eventually reconstructed there. Other people abandoned their jobs and turned to archaeology. They turned from archaeology to more like war. And one of the surprising things is the enthusiasm for some of the more senior members for active service. The director of the British Museum, a man called Sir Frederick Kenyon, the father of later Dame Kathleen Kenyon, had been an active member of the Territorial Army, and he eventually rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In September 1914, he dashed off to France to join his regiment, until the trustees of the British Museum persuaded the Ministry of the Army authorities that actually Sir Frederick had something rather more important to do, like running a museum in London. And he was returned somewhat reluctantly to London. I'm going to include somebody who is not really an archaeologist but had an effect on archaeology. This is the civil servant, Sir Schomburg, fabulously named Sir Schomburg MacDonald, who from 1902 to 1912 was the Secretary of the Office of Works, and together with Lord Curzon was a major figure in the proposal of legislation for the protection of ancient monuments, which turned into the 1913 Ancient Monuments Act, which set up the whole process of scheduling in something like the form we know it. He'd actually volunteered for a year's active service in the Boer War, where he joined one of the reserve yeoman infantry, cavalry regiments. Getting tired of a desk-based intelligence job in London, he volunteered for active service with the Cameron Highlanders, and despite his advanced age in his early 50s, he went to France, but unfortunately was wounded and died of wounds very shortly after reaching the Western Front. Perhaps the most serious, most important archaeological casualty was a French archaeologist, Joseph Deschelette. Again, somebody who was well past the age at which he could have been required to return to military service by the regiment in which he'd served earlier. Again, in his early 50s, he volunteered for service. He was probably the most important archaeologist in France at the time. He was still finishing the writing of his manual of archaeology, which is still a useful catalogue of finds. I've got a copy in my office at the moment. Again, unfortunately, I say killed, he was actually wounded and died of wounds a couple of days later in early October 1914. We called him the most, and quite rightly, the most famous archaeologist to die in the war, but that was largely because he was a veteran who'd had long enough in archaeology to establish his career and to be known for his archaeological work. Most other people we're going to be talking about were much younger and hadn't, even if they were successful archaeologists, they had not really got very far into their academic or archaeological careers, and so are perhaps much less well known nowadays. Shortly before he went to the Western Front, Deschelette wrote to his friend Camille Julien, who was Professor of Ancient History at the Collège de France in Paris, and he alludes to archaeology, the Gaulish cemeteries, which he played a part in describing in his manual, giving you, like me, a patriotic and fortifying vision. Whether it's an Iron Age sword or an 1886 rifle, it is always the same old struggle of the Celtic spirit against the brutal aggression of the Germans, which may give you some inspiration, some idea of why he, and he was by no means the oldest French soldier, veteran, to volunteer for active service. Other younger archaeologists volunteered. Some volunteered right from the beginning of the war in 1914, others became more active after conscription was introduced in 1916. There's no time to look at all of these, and I'll look at one or two in detail, but it's interesting to reflect on the nature of British archaeologists in 1914. I've looked at about 30 individuals who we, under one definition or another, call archaeologists, professional archaeologists at various stages of early stages of their careers in 1914. Of the 30, there are perhaps 2 women. 4 of them don't have university degrees. more than 50% had been to some of the major public schools of Britain, Winchester, Marlborough, Rugby. 26 of the 30 had university degrees, and of those, 19 or 20 had been to Oxford. The rest, except one, had been to Cambridge, and there was one at UCL. They came from a very restricted upper middle class, well-off professional background of families. They were very well educated. And we'll come back to that point in a moment. Crawford. Otis Crawford, who later became archaeology officer for the Ordnance Survey, quite unusual. But maybe when we know a little bit about his later rather obstinate character, he volunteered as a private and served on the Western Front for a brief time until he came back ill with pneumonia. He then went back and used some of his archaeological skills in service of the army in map making, became an RAF, RFC observer until his plane crashed and became, for the last few months of the war, he was a prisoner of war in Germany. The figure second from the right here is quite obviously our former president, Mortimer Wheeler. As far as I can see, only 2 former presidents of the Institute served in active service in the war. Wheeler was one, the other was Alfred Clapham, who served 4 years in the Royal Sussex Regiment and later became Secretary of the English Royal Commission. Wheeler volunteered almost immediately, became an officer in the training corps. He was serving, to start with, as a British-based training officer in the Royal Artillery. For a long time stationed near Colchester, and seems to have used some of his soldiers to do archaeological excavation in Colchester during the early part of the war. Then saw active service. At the end of the war, he was in Germany, stationed in Cologne. Before the war, he'd started doing a PhD on the Roman pottery of the Rhineland, and as he says, Cologne was the perfect place to be based because he had some months of leisure to survey the museums of Cologne and Bonn, and in his own words, he came back from the war with a PhD more or less in his knapsack. And as far as the records show, his PhD was awarded in 1919, so although you can't necessarily believe everything in Wheeler's memoirs, that one may be right. And of course there were casualties. One or two of them we'll look at. Guy Dickens, Winchester and Oxford, captain in the Royal Rifle Corps, killed at the Battle of the Somme. Leonard Cheeseman, Winchester and Oxford again, lecturer in ancient history at Oxford, and seen by Haverfield as one of his potential successors as a major figure in Roman British archaeology, wrote an important book on the auxilia of the Roman Imperial Army. I don't know if it's still of value now, but it was the standard work for many years. Again, he joined the Hampshire Regiment, was killed at Gallipoli shortly after landing in August 1915. He wasn't the only one. On the other side, in Germany, more or less his equivalent, Walter Bartel, who had recently appointed in that summer of 1914 as the director of the Roman-German Commission, and was one of the leading figures, the rising star of German provincial Roman archaeology, killed in the Vosges in 1915. Others served in a variety of capacities. Some of them, Bush Fox, Jocelyn Bush Fox, who later became Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments, seemed to have joined the army probably in 1915, rose to the rank of Major on the General Staff, and had a job as Director of Graves Registration, a somewhat bizarrely appropriate job for somebody who was an archaeologist and had spent time digging pre-dynastic cemeteries in Egypt. Other people went into rather more specialised jobs, ranging through various forms of intelligence work. And here I think it's important that a large percentage of the British archaeologists were, first of all, very well educated. They had very good contacts. Many of them had travelled extensively or lived extensively abroad. Many of them spoke languages, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, and were invaluable because of their linguistic skill, because of their knowledge of the territory, because of the knowledge and contact with individuals of power and authority in these countries. And archaeologists were particularly, a higher percentage of archaeologists seem to have served in a variety of intelligence services than one might have expected. Robin Collingwood, who was academically a professor of philosophy, was also a major figure in Romano-British archaeology. He did not volunteer in 1914. He actually went on teaching in Oxford and digging in Hadrian's Wall and Cumberland. And in late August 1914, he was digging on Hadrian's Wall when he was arrested by the police on suspicion of being a German spy. Eventually, though, in 1916, he joined Naval Intelligence, based in London, and was writing documentation about areas of northwestern Europe in advance of British Allied expansion into area which had been conquered by Germany. One of the most interesting, John Beazley, who was already an expert in classical archaeology, served in naval intelligence in what was known as Admiralty Room 40, which was the First World War equivalent of Bletchley Park. He was a naval code breaker. And it had an interesting discussion. Beazley later became one of the specialists in the study of Greek painted pottery. And there's been debating with colleagues who know more about this. What are the cognitive abilities of code breakers in things like pattern recognition, and are they in any way related to his visual ability in the study of painted pottery? One of the most flamboyant was John Myers. At the outbreak of the war, he was Wickham Professor of Ancient History, the Greek equivalent of Haverfield for Roman archaeology in Oxford. Now, he had spent time in the 1890s funded by the Craven Fellowship, a postgraduate award of 3 years funding for Oxford students, which actually required you to do something drastic like live in Greece for at least a year. He'd worked in Cyprus and then in southwestern Turkey. He knew the southwestern Turkey coastline extremely well. Late in life, he left an account of his wartime activity, which may have lent something, it may owe something to faulty memory or long-distance retrovision, but he gave an account of how he was summoned to the Admiralty to meet somebody who was only known by an initial, presumably M. But he was then recruited into naval intelligence and somehow managed to commandeer command of a series of vessels which he armed, and then he sailed up and down the Turkish coast, bombarding and shore establishments to try to tie down large parts of the Turkish army. Unfortunately, large parts of the Turkish ports were owned by Greek families who complained bitterly to the British about the way the British were bombing their factories. And he was eventually told to stop and summoned back to Athens for the usual thing, summon them back, promote them, and give them a desk job. Perhaps one of the most interesting and problematic people is a slightly older colleague, David Hogarth, who'd been a Craven Fellow again, this time travelling in Turkey for 3 years, and had spent much of his time excavating in Egypt, director of the British School at Athens, excavating again then in Crete and Egypt, before going back to be director of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. He'd spent a lot of time in Turkey and Egypt. He was fluent in Turkish and Arabic and was an ideal person for the naval establishment to get their hands on. He joined Naval Intelligence. In 1914-15, he started working in London on map making. The Royal Geographical Society was effectively a sub-branch of the War Office, producing maps of especially in the Mediterranean region. Hogarth then moved to the Mediterranean. One account says he was interrogating Turkish prisoners at Gallipoli, and then moved on to Cairo, where he was the effective head of an organisation called the Arab Bureau for the organisation of liaison with Arab contestants in the war. Hogarth is the figure in the middle, in the naval whites. The short figure on his right is, of course, T.E. Lawrence, who was also in the Arab Bureau. He'd spent much time in Syria, exploring and recording Crusader castles, and then working on the excavations at Carchemish. He was somewhat reluctantly let into the Arab Bureau. I think he was regarded as not quite right. But he said, on the fact that he spoke fluent Arabic, albeit with a terrible Syrian accent, was enough to get him in. And the other one on the right is a military liaison officer. And in the Arab Bureau, it was not only Hogarth and Lawrence, but also another famous archaeologist then working for naval intelligence, Leonard Woolley, who later went on to excavate and the British archaeologist Gertrude Bell, whom you saw before. So a hard core of the knowledge of the Arab Bureau was generated by archaeologists. And we saw the same on the other side. Fascinating character called Max von Oppenheim, who came from a fabulously rich banking family in Germany, was a passionate devotee of everything Oriental, travelled widely in Africa, lived in Cairo, student of Oriental cultures, and a major source of information about Arabic world and Egypt for the German imperial authorities. He was often described by the British as the Kaiser's spy. And this raises interesting questions about what we mean by a spy. He was certainly not undercover. The British knew all about him and regarded him as a figure of fun. They knew exactly what he was doing, and vast proportion of the documentation he sent back to Berlin was simply ignored by the Germans. But he became an archaeologist. Reporting on a route for the Baghdad Railway, and discovered the site of Tel Halaf, which turns out to be an important Neolithic site in Mesopotamia, but also had a much later Neo-Hittite assemblage like this statuary. He became, in some way, an equivalent to Lawrence, promoting the Arabic world to unite and to unite against the British. He was known as Abu Jihad, or Father of Jihad. And for a year at least, he was head of the Intelligence Bureau for the East in Berlin. As I say, these people are often referred to as spies. And it's undoubtedly true that many people started out as archaeologists and later in life worked for the intelligence services, like Lawrence. But at what point did they switch from being an archaeologist and becoming an agent? Even as archaeologists, they were to some extent agents of the state in carrying out foreign policy, whether more or less consciously. But the idea of them as spies doesn't really work. Most of these people worked quite openly, and people knew who they were and what they were doing. Actually, if you want a spy, you probably have to look to America. American activity in Mesoamerica, in particular in the Maya world, was dominated for much of the early 20th century by Sylvanus Morley, who was head of various research institutes and was the dominant figure. In 1917, he went to the naval authorities and volunteered to set up a spy ring in Mesoamerica. America at that point was really worried about the extent of German submarine activity in the West Mediterranean and the possibility of German attempts to preempt American entry into the war by establishing naval bases in Mexico. And it was this that interested the naval authorities, and Sylvanus Morley set up a spy network. A rather jingoistic biography recently called him the finest American spy of World War I, which may or may not be right, but one of his informants was a British medical doctor, an amateur Mayan archaeology specialist, with actually an honorary lectureship post in the Institute of Archaeology in Liverpool. And Thomas Gann was one of the informants for Morley's spy ring, reporting in particular on what was happening on the coastline of British Honduras. So that's the nearest thing you'll get to a British spy in First World War, I think. certainly in archaeology. But Morley's activity led to furious debate within academic circles in America. In particular, an attack by the anthropologist Franz Boas, a person, however, who uses science as a cover, political science, political spying, prostitutes science in an unpardonable way, and forfeits the right to be classed as a scientist. And this dispute about the role of an academic in warfare rumbled on in American academic circles for many years, and has recently been revived by the American army's embedding of anthropologists and sociologists in some of their armies working in the Near East. I've talked about active service. We haven't yet come across one person who was a conscientious objector. The nearest to it is Gordon Child, the Australian archaeologist who came to study in Oxford in 1914. He graduated in 1917, and at that point he had a choice. He was no longer exempt from conscription. If he stayed in Britain, he had to join up and decide whether to be a conscientious objector or not, or he had to get out of the country. And he went, in summer of 1917, he went to visit one of his friends who was a conscientious objector and was in prison in Dorchester jail. And the conversation was taken down. This is word for word, without the punctuation, as written down by the warder who overheard the conversation. We, and this is Child speaking, we are disappointed about the latest results of submarine operations. This is the near height of German submarine warfare, sinking British ships in the Atlantic. We're disappointed. A few weeks ago they were doing splendid work in sinking a lot of ships. If they could have kept it up a few weeks, we were in hopes it would make England plead for peace. But they don't seem to be able to keep it up. There seems to be no chance of food shortage. Nothing but that will rouse the workers. If that could be brought about, we should then have a revolution like they have in Russia. That went straight back to the Home Office, and thereafter Child was closely monitored by the Secret Service until he left the country to go back to Australia. In Australia, he had a job as a senior tutor in Sydney University for a year, until he was forced out of that job for his left-wing and anti-war views, he thus became one of only 2 academics known to have lost their job because of opposition to the war. The other one was Bertrand Russell, who was forced to resign from his fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge. Next, switch quickly to discovery. You do not dig trenches through 500-mile transect across Western Europe without finding an awful lot of archaeology. And they did. Much of it went unrecorded. There are all sorts of anecdotal stories about soldiers bringing back souvenirs from the war, which included flint objects as well as German uniforms and so on. Just one or two of the more exotic stories. One bronze hoard, probably buried about 800 BC, discovered by German troops, rapid excavation terminated by a French artillery bombardment, led to the rapid dispersal of the objects which were then lost sight of. 1948, after the Second World War in Germany, shortage of money, extreme poverty in southwestern Germany, led to a retired army officer depositing some bronze rings in the church collection plate. These were recognised as Bronze Age. A long programme of detective work finally located a number of the other objects, and the hoard was eventually published in 1975. Another remarkable story, a cemetery, at an Iron Age cemetery of La Tène period, 400, 200 BC, at Boussy-le-Long in the Aisne Valley of France. They were Germans digging a communication trench until the observant Hauptmann Edward Peilmann found in the side of the trench remains of human bones and metalwork. Then, by coincidence, there was a 21-year-old German archaeology student in the trenches nearby. A student at Birmingham, almost certainly been taught by Gustav Cossiner, although we don't know how much archaeological experience he had. Over the next 6 weeks, he actually excavated a cemetery. And we have the plans that he drew. In the middle at the bottom is a plan drawn in the re-excavation of the site by French archaeologists in the 1990s, where you see a large number of graves on the left, a huge chunk through the middle which had been dug without archaeological excavation was now flooded. This is a gravel quarry. And you can reconstruct where the excavation by this young man, Hans Niggermann, had taken place. The volume, it's now been published in 3 volumes. The second volume is more or less a republication of Niggermann's notes and a record of his drawings. All the objects were sent back to Berlin Museum, properly catalogued. And in the discussion of this work, the French archaeologist Jean-Paul Demoule says, you have to admit it, but the work which Niggermann did under these conditions was better than almost everything done in France until recently. The one area where trenches were dug on territory which was under German control, not Belgium or France, but was Alsace and Lorraine, which had been in France until after the Franco-Prussian War, after 1871, was ceded to Germany. They had museums of German technical authority and expertise. Anybody who's done research in French museums knows that Alsace and Lorraine are infinitely better than anywhere else in France. And this showed. The best research, the best sort of rescue archaeology was done in Alsace and Lorraine. In Alsace, the work was done largely by the curator of archaeology at Strasbourg, Robert Forer. This is him in his office. Excavated a number of sites. This was a barrow into which German troops were about to dig a machine gun emplacement. He excavated this chariot grave of the early Iron Age Hallstatt period. At the end of the war, Forer, who was a Swiss citizen, kept his job as curator of Strasbourg Museum. Further north, in Lorraine, his equivalent at Metz Museum was Johann Baptist Koiner, who was a German national who had an amazing capacity for having himself photographed in his characteristic coat and cap. And this is him on 2 sites, a major Roman altar discovered in trenching, and a late Roman and Merovingian cemetery being dug, again, discovered in trenching opera, and both of these properly recorded. At the end of the war, Alsace and Lorraine were returned to French authority. Forer, a Swiss citizen, kept his job. Koiner was dismissed and went back to a museum job in Germany. But the work they did was the best. Elsewhere, we have some records from French trenches in northern France. A number of people recorded what was found and published accounts in the Bulletin of the French Prehistoric Society. I haven't found any equivalent of that done by British archaeologists on the Western Front. One area where there was, again, another outbreak of competitive archaeology was on the Salonika front. After Gallipoli, the British and French troops moved into the head of the Aegean Sea, based around what's now Salonika, in areas including the major Greek city of Amphipolis. The French were in nominal control. Their army there was led by General Sarai, who seems to have had sort of ambitions of Napoleonic grandeur. He insisted that his army was called l'Armée de l'Orient, which was the title Napoleon used for his army which invaded Egypt. And Sarai took with him, like Napoleon, a fleet of savants, including archaeologists, architects and photographers to do archaeological work. And this was a part of the major project of going to Macedonia, a country which had been under Ottoman control, had only just been opened up for archaeological exploration and was ripe for research and publication. His general staff also included large numbers of former students of the French School of Archaeology in Athens, not employed as archaeologists, but as in Britain, employed in roles like interpreter or translator for the general staff. When the Germans reinforced the Bulgarian armies on the northern front in opposition to the French and the British, they set up a Macedonian Geographical Commission under the command of Hans Dragendorf, a name that will strike fear into Roman pottery specialists as the expert on Samian. This is Herr Professor Dr. Dragendorf. And he led a team which included geologists and historians and botanists and archaeologists who embarked on a full-scale research project focused in particular on Roman sites. Now the British found that you could hardly dig a trench anywhere there without finding masses of pottery, and their reaction was probably the least coordinated. They soon realised they had major finds on their hands and had to do something about it, and so established an archaeological team to try to collect the important material and store it in a museum established in the White Tower on the seafront at Salonika. And in charge of this collection was, again, the Royal Naval Reserve Lieutenant Commander Ernest Gardner, otherwise known as Professor Gardner, Yates Professor of Archaeology at UCL. And this is the White Tower where they eventually set up a system for a regional team to record and collect what was found and bring it back to the museum. After a year or more, Gardner was recalled to other naval intelligence duties in London, and his place was taken by another archaeologist, Eric Peat, who at that point was a lecturer in Egyptology at Manchester, who went on to more senior posts in the academic career afterwards. He had been one of the field officers, and he now took command of the project. At the end of the war, huge quantities of material were in the hands of British archaeologists. Eventually, the Greek government made the best of a bad job and decided to donate what the British had to the British as a thank offering for their help. And something like 3,500 objects from this project ended up in the British Museum, where people have recently started cataloguing. One of the objects of contention was the Lion and Amphipolis, a major ceremonial monument, originally found in an earlier war where Greek soldiers had found the base of it. British soldiers found parts of the lion in 1916 and were apparently attempting to export it to a boat offshore until a Bulgarian bombardment stopped them. An officer came along and prevented further attempts to export them. Other British activities are documented photographically, which seems to have gone rather further than just finding potsherds while you're digging a trench, and look extraordinarily like quite deliberate tomb looting. Final theme, very briefly, is the fate of monuments in war. In December 1914, a German flotilla bombarded parts of the coast of northeastern England with raids on Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool. This was the first time that Britain had been actively invaded or damaged. Zeppelin raids on London didn't begin until January 1915, so 137 casualties brought it home to the people living in Britain. And this was something that was regarded as barbarous, not because it was an invasion, but because of some of the things that were damaged. Whitby Abbey, the west end of Whitby Abbey was damaged. In fact, if you look there, that's the Abbey, and on the headland to the left is what's now called a Coast Guard station, which was a naval communication base in the First World War and was in active use as a naval communication facility. So that may have been a legitimate target very near to the Abbey. Scarborough Castle was also hit, but Scarborough Castle was also an active military base, not just a base of a garrison, but also a communication base up and down the coast. So whether these were legitimate targets or not is a question that's rumbled on, but certainly the attacks on Whitby and Scarborough resonated widely in the British population. But by then, other things had already happened. In Belgium, after the initial German invasion, firstly, they burnt a large part of Louvain in alleged retaliation against civilian fire on German troops, and they burnt the university library. This resonated throughout Europe and North America as an act of extreme barbarism, not just burning a historic city, but actually destroying the library and destroying knowledge. Shortly after came a second event, which ranked in the same category of barbaric destruction when the German artillery bombarded Reims Cathedral and caused considerable damage to the northwest turret. Also causing a huge fire in the roof, setting fire to the Bishop's Palace and the Archaeological Museum nearby. And I'm not going to attempt to adjudicate on what happened, but there are at least two major versions. Firstly, if you're French, you believe that it was in use as a military hospital. Hence, up here you have the Red Cross flag flying on the turret. It was actually, at some stage, it probably had been a hospital for wounded German soldiers, and the French regarded it as a hospital as well as a historic monument and not a legitimate military target. If you're German, you believe that it had been used as an observation post. French troops had been located there, and at some point a searchlight had even been installed on top of it. So this is what you find on the tower now is a searchlight. There's a quotation, the text up there, I've enlarged it over there. The French used the cathedral at the base of military operations and thereby endangered this artistic masterpiece. But by this point, the damage had been done and it was too late. German reputations were in extreme danger. 4th of October, 1914, a group of German academics, 93 of them, signed a manifesto. Eventually about 4,000 people, most of the professors in Germany, signed up to this, although some later claimed they didn't even know what they were signing. And it's a protest against the rising criticism of Germans as the barbarians destroying civilization in Europe. It's not true that our troops treated Louvain brutally. Our troops, with aching hearts, were obliged to fire a part of the town as a punishment. Needless to say, this manifesto itself caused even more problems in parts of Western Europe and North America for the tone adopted. And in particular, the idea of the legacy of Goethe, Beethoven and Kant is fine, but the paragraph above that shows that the sort of European civilization that they were trying to protect was a very white European male one. And this was the time, of course, when they were exterminating the population of German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. But in response, Germans set up an operation under the general title of Kunstschutz, or art protection. It's a forerunner of the Second World War monuments men and the movement to protect ancient monuments in time of warfare that we see now. It was in the hands of an art historian, Paul Clement, who was the director of historic monument conservation in the Rhineland and professor of art history. And after the war, he published a book, Kunstschutz im Kriege, which is, at one level, a documentary account of the steps taken by the German military authorities to protect ancient monuments, and was widely regarded as a sort of manual of how to do it by people considering the effect of war on monuments thereafter. And it does contain considerable amounts of information about the centralisation and storage of portable monuments, the protection of ancient monuments, the sorts of things you can do to, if they are damaged, the sorts of things you can do to do emergency repairs until you can protect them properly. If you read it carefully, though, it's partly that, but it's also a prolonged whinge about the criticism, how unfair it was of German destruction. It largely seeks to put the blame for the destruction of monuments on Britain and France. Germany was only acting through military necessity, where it did unfortunately bomb a few buildings. So it's an interesting document in self-justification. But it is true that the Germans did put in place, for instance in Belgium, even in September 1914, they sent a director of one of the major museums in Berlin, Otto von Falke, to protect movable, portable art objects in Belgium as the army advanced. From 1916 onwards, there was a German, effectively rescue archaeology team attached to the German army in Belgium, actually staffed by two people who became famous in German archaeology, Gerhard Bersu and Wilhelm Unversagt, who are both famous German archaeologists of the later period, effectively doing rescue archaeology, recording what was damaged, and doing rescue excavation in advance of military operations. Clement himself took charge of activities, first of all in Belgium, then in France, then in the Eastern Front, and then throughout the whole of the German war zone. And he's a variety of rather badly coordinated activities to document what had been destroyed, to preserve what remained, and to raise awareness of monuments among military personnel. And certainly by the end of the First World War, most German armies in all theatres of war had specialist archaeologists or architectural historians attached to the general staff with a responsibility for managing, as far as possible, the protection of ancient monuments in their zone. Destruction was inevitable. Some of the cathedrals and churches suffered perhaps more than most other buildings, especially in the flatlands of northwestern Europe. High buildings not only served as landmarks in the low-lying landscape of where was a village, that's the tower, that's what you aim at, but also many church towers were used as artillery observations, the places for artillery spotters, and therefore raised the possibility that they were legitimate targets. And in some cases, as armies retreated, they deliberately blew up the churches like this one. One of the most successful of these groups operated actually in the Near East under the command of Theodor Wiegand, who'd been an active director of antiquities for Berlin museums, really operating as a promoter of German archaeological expeditions into the Near East in order to acquire objects for Berlin museums. And he took command of a team whose job it was to take overall care of monuments in German control to prevent damaging development even by civilians. And while they were in control of Jerusalem, they do seem to have done good work in preventing the destruction of historic buildings to facilitate modern development, but also to collect material for museums. So this warfare about who had damaged more monuments the other side led to a sort of tit-for-tat spat in a lot of the architectural historical literature. I just want to read you a short translation of one paragraph written by the French architectural historian Émile Marle. Translating says, "Those barbarians, Germans, possessed no artistic spirit whatever. They only knew how to destroy. In the art of the Middle Ages, one cannot find a single German element, but on the contrary, Germans took over this medieval art, which it boasts of having created, ready-made from Italy and France, just as the French Romanesque architecture is one of the strongest witnesses for the creative genius of France, so that of Germany is a clear proof of her creative impotence. On one side stands a people who have received their creative gifts from heaven, on the other side a race of imitators." And that was from an architectural historian whom Germans in other circumstances would have respected. So who is the protector of civilization and what is the civilization they are seeking to protect became an important matter of conflict. Neither side wanted to be seen as the barbarian destroyers. And episodes like Louvain Library, Reims Cathedral, became symbolic of that. They were extremely well known in America. The sinking of the Lusitania only added to anti-German feelings, and those events did play a significant part in the ultimate decision of the United States to come into the war on the side of Britain and France. So, the concept of civilization. At the end of the war, Victory Medal was issued. The version of it issued by British and the Empire had on the back, had on its reverse, the Great War for Civilization. Quite clear which side the British thought was civilized. But the war also, one thing I haven't had time to talk about, and in fact is under-researched, is the effect on archaeology of the war and the way in which archaeologists reacted to the concept of civilization and to the way in which the growth of civilization and the change in cultural practices was brought about, and the mechanisms of social change. All about the value of civilization. Ezra Pound, in his long poem, Hugh Selwyn Mowbray, published in 1920, this is a short selection. There died a myriad for a botched civilization, for 2 gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books. It's difficult not to believe that he's referring to the west front of Rheims Cathedral and Louvain Library in that, as a sort of rather jaundiced perception of the sort of Western civilization which people have been fighting for. One of the most interesting reactions, I think, is from another rather under-recognised book, Growth of Civilization by William Perry, who's often written off as one of those hyper-diffusionist idiots who explains everything as arriving from Egypt. Well, that's part of what he wrote, but The Growth of Civilization was a very effective book, originally published in 1924, and he's got, in the second part of it, there's a very interesting discussion of the origins of warfare. In the earliest stages, human society was peaceful. Warfare has developed as an accidental excrescence. Warfare has grown like a parasitic plant until it now threatens to destroy the host on which it lives. He also then goes on to relate the rise of warfare to the emergence of class society. And although he doesn't say it in so many terms, the subtext is you won't get rid of warfare until you get rid of class society and class divisions. That may have been a little bit too left-wing for him to say at the time in 1924, but that is the clear subtext. It's one of the most overtly, but if understated, political interpretations of archaeology, but was completely understandable in the context of 1924 and his reaction to the war. Thank you very much for listening.